Hello and welcome to AP Comparative Government. Today I'm going to be talking about Iran. I think in a lot of ways, Iran is actually my favorite AP Comparative Government country. I think it's the most interesting in a lot of different ways. And I think that's really because of the way that Iran and Iranians try to marry together elements of a theocracy and elements of a democracy, which, when I put those two things into my head, smoke starts to come out of my ears and my brain melts down. But they managed to figure out ways to do it. Now, our problem with Iran, when we approach it, especially students in the United States, is we have to take off our United States hats when we think about Iran. Because, particularly since 9/11, Iran has been defined by the conflict between the West and the Islamic states of the Middle East. And while that is important to us, it's probably the most important thing. But in Iran, that's just one aspect of their foreign policy. And there's many, many other things that we should really try to continue. You can try to boil down Iran to black and white terms. Namely, will Iran continue to be a theocracy? Will it continue to be ruled by religious clerics? Or is it going to become more secular with a separation of church and state? You can try that. I'm just not sure how well it works. At present, Iran is a theocracy. It has a supreme leader who has the ultimate ability to interpret Sharia, which is religious law, and that's what gives him his legitimacy. Iran is our only theocracy, at least it's our only of our six formal states. It's a theocracy. But it has a lot in common with newly industrialized states like Mexico. In fact, Iran, Mexico, and Nigeria all share a critical fact in common. They're all dependent economically on income that's generated from oil to a large extent. Maybe Mexico a little bit less, but certainly Nigeria and Iran. And this is true more of Iran than the other two states. Iran is the second largest producer of oil in the Middle East and the fourth largest in the world. But politically, as we're about to see, Iran remains very much a contradiction. Now, when we talk about power, authority, and legitimacy, we really have to start to look at Iran historically. Iran has had somewhat of a similar boundary, at least for the Iranian, or sometimes you could say Persian homeland, for a long time. Iran is essentially a giant plateau surrounded by mountainous regions. It was the heartland of the Persian Empire. In classical sense, we call that the Achaemenid Empire. This is the empire that is ultimately conquered by Alexander the Great in the 4th century BCE. The Achaemenid Empire was Zoroastrian. It was a state-sponsored dualist religion that saw elements of good and evil in the world and thought that the world would be decided by which one of those two sides won out. It was a religion that worshiped fire in its essence. The other important thing to keep in mind is the Persian Empire, in all of its permutations, and it has many even after the Achaemenid Empire ultimately collapses, sets the stage for an authoritarian style of government. Persian empires, whether we're talking about the Persians or the Parthians, and even the later Islamic caliphates, they're all authoritarian. So Iran has a long history of authoritarian governments. But of course, we can't talk about Iran unless we talk about Islam. Islam is of the utmost importance when we talk about Iran. It was devastated by the Mongol invasions of the 13th century, but that didn't do anything to shake the commitment of the population to Islam. Iran is defined by Shiism. It's a Shiite country. This is a sect of Islam. It's founded by Ali, the son in law of the Prophet Muhammad. The true heirs of Ali are called imams. And actual heirs, or imams, were the head of Shiism until the 12th descendant of Ali died in the 9th century. Upon his death, he became known as the hidden imam, who would one day return. But until he did, the rulers of Iran stood in his place as the true heirs of Islam. Now, it's worth remembering that Shiism is a minority sect of the Islamic faith. Most Muslims today are Sunni Muslims. Critically, Iraq, the neighbor to Iran, is Sunni. And there have been a lot of conflicts between those two nation states since they left the British protectorates in the early 20th centuries. Now, we have to understand that the government in Iran, in its current form, its current regime, starts in 1979. Until 1979, Iran was ruled by an authoritarian secular ruler called the Pavishah, which roughly means King of Kings, which is actually the old Achaemenid title for the king. And he was very pro-Western, but he was overthrown in 1979 by religious extremists who were following a guy by the name of Ayatollah Khomeini. This was a pure revolution in every sense of the word, because after 1979, Iran's government completely changes and it becomes a theocracy. The Constitution of 1979, amended in 1989, just before the Ayatollah's death, is a mixture of theocracy and democracy. The obvious conflicts between democratic reform and theocratic rule have created a crisis of legitimacy in Iran. Between 1997 and 2005, reformers in Iran were ascendant. But in 2005, the conservative Mahmoud Ahmadinejad was elected president. And since then, Iran has been more theocratic, though he is no longer president. And I'll talk about that in a moment. And making matters worse, and again, I'll come back to this as well in a little while, not all religious clerics in Iran even agree on what is the correct interpretation of Islamic law. So you've got reformers versus religious conservative clerics, but then within the clerics, you have a multitude of different opinions and factional disputes. So, needless to say, Iran is the land of cleavages. Now let's talk about political culture. The first one is authoritarianism versus totalitarianism. It's important to understand that while Iranian leaders claim to be all powerful, they are not. Even going back to the Islamic Caliphate, Iranian rulers have been authoritarian and not totalitarian. Maybe that's not because of desire, maybe that's because of means and ability. We also have to think about the union of politics and religion. The revolution of 1979 melded political and religious authority into one, making Iran a pure theocracy. And the basis of legitimacy of that regime is Sharia, which is Islamic law. It's a huge source of legitimacy for the Iranian government because the supreme leader ultimately is the person who is sort of a stand-in for the imam, is a stand-in for the person who gets the ultimate say on Sharia, which is this incredibly complicated system of moral guidelines for how to live your life. And it's been interpreted differently over the years and can be really confusing. But what you need to know is because the supreme leader has the ultimate say over that, that gives them pure traditional legitimacy, something that's very important in Iran. And we also have to remember that while Iran was never officially colonized, Europeans and other Western nations did take advantage of Iran's oil. And Iran today remains very defensive of its sovereignty. Geography is also important here. A ton of Iran is pretty big actually in terms of geography, but almost all of it's desert. Hence, the population tends to be very concentrated geographically. To that extent, it's very similar to Russia, where we have this huge, huge geographic country with the population living in a very confined space. Culturally, Aspects of ancient Persia are very much alive in Iran even today, even after Islam. Many Iranians continue to speak Parsi, which is Persian actually. And then, of course, there's Iranian nationalism. This goes, really with the sort of religion, European colonialism, and ancient Persia. It's kind of all tied together in this Iranian nationalism that we see. In fact, studies after studies have shown consistently that Iranians are much more nationalistic than people living in other Arabic states. And to a large extent, I do think that that is because Iran is the only Shiite state in the region. And as a result, it doesn't have as much in common with some of its other Islamic neighbors. Now, as I said, let's talk cleavages because there's a lot of them in Iran, and they're very important. The first one is, of course, religion. The 1979 Constitution technically guarantees religious freedoms to minorities, except for Sunnis, by the way. But that still leaves 10% of the population which are religious minorities and who are persecuted. And to be clear, Sharia or Islamic law treats Muslims and non Muslims differently. And because Sharia is the basis of the laws in Iran today, that means Muslims and non Muslims are not treated the same. Civil rights really isn't a thing in Iran. And then there's ethnicity. 51% of Iranians are Persian. Problematically, though, many of these ethnic minorities who make up the other 49% live in regionally distant parts of Iran, worrying the Iranian government that these groups may become separatist. Then there's social class. Iran has had a really hard time developing a pure middle class. And so while the lower middle and lower classes tend to support the regime, tend to be very conservative, tend to be much more religious, the upper classes are more secular and tend to be a source of criticism of the regime. Exacerbating this problem is that upper middle class families and the upper middle class in general has all but disappeared since 1979. And because as a result of oftentimes the ostracism of the regime from other parts of the world, it's been very difficult for Iran to develop economically and has only recently done a much better job of that. Now, the biggest cleavage in Iran, though, is the break between the reformers and the conservatives. There's been a debate ever since 1979 as to what extent the state should democratize. Most reformers still want Iran to be Islamic, but they want the state to be much more secular than it is right now. Conservatives want to hold the line. They want to keep in place everything that happened in 1979. And this divide has led to a lot of political conflict in the history of modern Iran. And then, as I mentioned, there's a clerical division. There's a cleavage between pragmatic clerics and conservative clerics. Pragmatic clerics are often in favor of liberalization, especially economic liberalization, a move toward free market systems. Conservative clerics do not support reform at all, and certainly they don't support economic reform. And that's because of the conservative perspective that everything must be governed by Sharia. Everything must be governed by Islamic religious law. And Sharia law expressly protects private property and it expressly protects economic inequality. So any efforts by the state to level the playing field are usually opposed by the conservative clergy. Civil society in Iran has been problematic since the 1920s, when the government tried to intervene in people's lives in a more forceful way. Even back then, for example, liberal university professors were forced out and left Iran, or sometimes voluntarily left Iran, and were replaced by Islamic conservative professors. Now, there's a slight exception to this rule, and that's between 1997 and 2005. Iran experienced the so called Tehran Spring. Tehran is the capital city. And this was when President Khatami tried to secure individual liberties for Iranians. But as we will discuss later, this was very difficult because the Iranian president actually has very, very limited powers. But then things reversed course under the next president, conservative Ahmadinejad, and that's a difficult name to say. Things like newspapers were banned, the internet and books were censored, peaceful protests were banned. So, in general, civil society became much more highly restricted. However, one sign of hope is that Iran is a very young state. Because in the 1980s, the regime strongly encouraged large families. There are a lot of people under the age of 40 in Iran today, and they show signs of being very attracted to Western culture. Oftentimes, this is just pop culture, but culture nonetheless. Though this too, Ahmadinejad and his government have cracked down on. What are we to make of political participation in Iran? First of all, we have to talk about the Iranian government and its relationship toward women. Iran calls its policy toward women equality with difference. Sharia law tends to favor men in most instances. Women, in fact, can still be considered the wards of their male relatives even after they reach 18, the age of majority. While many women are uneducated and do stay home, which is traditional, women are allowed to attend college in Iran now. Many educated Iranian women harbor major resentment toward the regime, and the reasons for that are a little obvious, I suppose. And this has oftentimes led to protests. And those protests have not always ended well. The military has moved in to crack down on women repeatedly and protesting, particularly of young women. And those sorts of stories, when they hit the news, tend to push away foreign investment and rapprochement with foreign nations. The Iranian government has tried to crack down on some traditional practices like the stoning of women for adultery, but it still happens. Plus, in the legislature in Iran, the women only account for 5.9% of the total seats. Second lowest amongst our six nations, only Nigeria is lower than Iran. Let's talk about political institutions and political parties. While the 1979 Constitution does allow for political parties, the government actually didn't allow them until 1997. Note, in the 2017 election, both the executives of the Construction Party and the Islamic Coalition Party received less than 2% of the total votes. So if you kind of look at the screen here, what I'm telling you is the two extreme parties, so extreme right and extreme left, get very, very, very little of the vote when this is being processed. More than anything else, these parties in Iran represent factionalism, typically amongst the elite, both in terms of point of view and personality. The way that our extreme parties tend to try to get some influence over the government is that they form coalitions. These parties form factions and coalitions that are constantly shifting, and they break apart if their chosen candidates win because they won and now they don't need the other party anymore. The longer that a faction is defeated, somewhat maybe counterintuitively, the more likely it is for that faction to stay together. Let's also talk about elections. There have been a couple of really important elections in the past 2 decades in Iran, none more so than the presidential election of 2009. This election pitted the incumbent Ahmadinejad against the Reform Consensus candidate, Hussein Mousavi. In the prior election of 2005, many reform minded voters didn't vote at all, allowing Ahmadinejad to cruise to victory. So when voter turnout in 2009 for the next presidential election, because presidents serve 4-year terms, skyrocketed to 85%, reformers were hopeful. But the results reported by the state did not match the turnout. The state announced that Ahmadinejad had won with 63% of the vote. Reformers were furious. They believed the election had been rigged. The government agreed to a recount, and the supreme leader, more on him in a minute, announced Ahmadinejad had in fact won. Reformers still thought the election had been stolen, but the real significance, the real takeaway from the election of 2009 is that it dramatically reduced the legitimacy of both the government and the supreme leader, especially the supreme leader. There are interest groups in Iran, and some are more successful than others. Probably the most important one is Workers' House. The symbol is there on the screen. This is an interest group for factory workers, for industrial workers. They hold a yearly May Day rally for workers' rights, which in 1999 turned into a protest that shut down Tehran. Though protests like this don't always end well, a bus driver strike in 2007 was brutally repressed. And it's also worth pointing out that radio and television in Iran is run by the government, though magazines and newspapers are independently owned. And I should note that compared to other Middle Eastern countries, Iranian media has relatively more power to criticize the government than, say, that in Saudi Arabia or Syria or Egypt. Now, Iran is a highly centralized state, but administratively, it's divided into provinces, districts, subdistricts, and local areas. While the Constitution does provide for local elected officials, no elections were held until 1999, 20 years after the Constitution was ratified. When these elections did take place, reformers won most of the seats, making life difficult for the conservative clergy. Iran's government is complicated, but in general, you need to remember that, in all ways, it's a blend of democracy and theocracy. But it's a blend, it's not 50-50. Those proportions are different depending upon what you're looking at. Okay, so there are several key parts of the government: the supreme leader, the guardian council, the assembly of religious experts, and the expediency council. But these are not branches in the traditional sense. There is not a separation of powers between these government institutions. Each institution has legislative, judicial, and executive functions. And these government institutions supersede every other part of Iran's government, local government, for example, because they have this thing called jurist's guardianship. Jurist guardianship means that these groups understand Sharia law, and because they understand Sharia more than local, provincial, or district governments, that gives them veto authority on anything that's done in the lower branches. Let's talk about the supreme leader. It's a great title, right? And it makes sense because basically the supreme leader is the top of the Iranian government. Initially, the post was filled by Ayatollah Khomeini, the guy who ran the 1979 revolution. It was supposed to go to a body of 2 to 3 clerics upon his death, but his followers didn't trust the clerics, and so amended the constitution. And they appointed a new Ayatollah, Ayatollah Khamenei, for life. He is the supreme ruler today. The supreme leader is what's called the faqih, which means he gets ultimate say over the interpretation of Sharia. That gives him a huge amount of authority and powers, several of which you can see listed on the screen. Now, this is the rare case, and this question usually does come up on the test, where the head of state is also the head of government. Khamenei is the head of state, but unlike the King of England and Great Britain, he has tremendous and very real power. Now, there's a couple of other organizations that play roles in the Iranian government. There's the Guardian Council, made up of, and you can probably just see where I'm going with this, where basically everyone is a male. Again, this gets back to Sharia. We can talk about that later on. There's the Guardian Council. The most important thing that the Guardian Council typically does is it decides who gets to run for office. It can issue laws of its own, but basically the Guardian Council is the vetting process for the Iranian government. Not everyone is eligible to run for what's called the Mashe, which is the lower house of the Iranian legislative branch. In order to run for a seat in government, you have to put your name forward first. And the Guardian Council gets to essentially cross off names that it doesn't like. As you can guess, a lot of reformers' names get crossed off. There's the Assembly of Religious Experts that's in charge of selecting the supreme leader. They could remove the supreme leader under the rules, but they never have. Then there's the Expediency Council. These are not necessarily all religious clerics, and their job is essentially to refer disputes between the Guardian Council and the Mashes. And the Mashes are the lower house of the Iranian legislative branch, as we'll get to in just a second. Now, there is a president. Iran does have a president, but it's not technically a presidential system since the president isn't really the ultimate executive. In this case, the head of the, I'll put it in air quotes, executive branch does not have nearly the amount of power as the president of the United States, Mexico, Nigeria does. This is why we say Iran does not have a presidential system. Still, the president is the highest ranking democratic official in Iran. He is elected to a 4-year term and cannot serve more than 2 consecutive terms. While democratically elected, the president must be a Shiite and agree to uphold Islamic principles. The president also heads a massive bureaucracy, which has roughly doubled in size since 1979. Said bureaucracy is, however, dominated by the clerics. There are also nationalized linkage institutions called bunyads. These institutions actually started before the 1979 revolution, but have become nationalized afterwards. The heads of these government bodies normally have ties to the centralized government. So these are local government institutions. The bunyads are a system by which the centralized government could exert its authorities in the provinces, in districts outside of the capital region. Unfortunately, because there's no oversight, it's honestly sometimes anyone's guess as to what exactly these bunyads do and if they do anything at all. Let's talk about the Majais. Iran has a unicameral legislature called the Majais, though in some ways the Assembly of Religious Experts has acted as an upper house since 1989. Both are directly elected by the people. The Majais were created back in 1906 and were maintained by the 1979 institution. In the year 2000, reformers took 80% of the seats in a coalition party called the Khordad Front. But then, starting in 2004, the Guardian Council figured it out and started to ban most reformers from running. And so today, the Majais has become extremely conservative and much more in line with the Guardian Council. Of course, there is a judicial branch in Iran. The chief judge in Iran is a religious cleric, as he mostly interprets religious law. He is appointed by the supreme leader directly for 1 5-year term. It's then his job as chief judge to maintain the judiciary. He appoints all the judges on the Supreme Court, which is the highest court in the land. That being said, I do want to point out that the Guardian Council and the Supreme Leader can both override the Chief Judge and the Supreme Court. And that's because they're considered to have more authority when it comes to interpreting Sharia. Both of those institutions have the final say over the interpretation of the law. Interestingly, there's actually more of a life, of a notion of judicial review in Iran, but it just doesn't work the same way as it does in the United States. It's based on the supremacy of Sharia, which is extremely complicated. Really, the goal of the judicial branch is to ensure the proper accommodation of Islam to a constitutional framework. Today, Sharia is interpreted very strictly. Alcoholism, drug dealing, adultery, and homosexuality are all capital offenses. They're all offenses for which the penalty is death. Male and female defendants in court also receive very disparate sentences, as do, I mentioned, Muslims and non Muslims. Interestingly, though, the present 1979 regime kept much of the judicial structure in place from the previous Pavashah's regime. So we've got Sharia law and then we've got Quran law. Quran law are secular statutes that are passed by the Majlis. But once again, and I know I sound like I'm repeating myself here because I am, these can never contradict Sharia. And so, really, Iran is based on Sharia law. Now, there is a really big army in Iran, but the regular army is for defensive purposes. It defends the borders. Then there's another army called the Revolutionary Guard, and that's different. It defends the republic, i.e., the regime. The supreme leader is the commander-in-chief of this elite armed forces unit, and its only real job is to prevent a coup. One part of the Revolutionary Guard that's often a source of international attention and condemnation is the Baji. The Baji is often used to quell protests and sometimes often brutally. This unit actually dates back to the Iran-Iraq War. And then in 1999, the Bashi was used somewhat violently to contain student protests and gets called out every once in a while. Iran presently has 523,000 active troops. That makes it the 8th largest military in the world. This is disproportionately large, given that Iran ranks 17th in world population. The Revolutionary Guard, you should know, has become increasingly politically important in recent years, as many of its former members now sit on the Baji. Issues and policies in Iran. Policymaking in Iran is very complicated. Laws can originate in many different places and can be blocked by many different institutions. But the two most important policymaking institutions in Iran are the Majlis and the Guardian Council. There's a couple of sort of policy debates that are just ongoing in Iran. One I already talked about, and that's conservative versus reform. The conservative faction wants to uphold the policies put in place after 1979. They believe the state should be a theocracy, and they tend to be anti-Western. Reformers believe the 1979 Constitution needs significant reform and want to become more secular. They tend to accept the West and free market ideas. Then there's statists versus free market people. Many people in Iran feel the government should control the economy, though they are not communists. And that makes Iran a bit of an exception, by the way. Free marketers, on the other hand, they want the government out. They want the government to remove price controls, encourage private enterprise, etc., etc. Clearly, these groups, as you can probably guess, tend to align. Reformers want the state to be more of a statist organization. They want the state more involved. They want it to take care of its people better. The conservative group tends to be more free market since, again, income inequality and property inequality is part of Sharia. Now, one crucial casualty of this factionalism in Iran has been major brain drain, which Iran has experienced since 1979. It has been very difficult for Iran to hold on to its intellectual classes. The last thing I want to point out here before we talk about economics is the central place that the city of Qom plays in Iranian culture. Qom is a city about 60, and I mean an actual city. It's 60 miles south of Tehran. It's a seminary city that it basically exists to train clerics. There's a picture of it up on the screen. Many clerics and scholars in Qom do not believe that clerics should be playing such an active role in the government. They should be religious clerics, and that's all. According to them, everyone needs to just do what they can to wait for the return of the 12th Imam. To them, the supreme leader cannot base his legitimacy as sort of the ultimate interpreter of Sharia law. So they tend to be one of the biggest critics of the regime. Economics. Ayatollah Khomeini famously said during the revolution that economics is for donkeys. So, as you can expect, there's a major divide amongst Iranians how the government should approach the economy. Before 1979, Iran was our quintessential rentier state. That is, that it received nearly all its income from the sale of oil. Now, many Iranians today still get subsidies from the government. In fact, in 2013, the government handed out 100 billion in subsidies, hence why so many Iranians are statists. But starting in 2015, partly as a result of ongoing sanctions, Iran's economy entered a steep recession. These problems continue to this day, and Iran remains heavily dependent on oil production to support the Iranian economy. An allied issue here is population. After the 1979 revolution, the government encouraged large families. The Iranian government, however, realized that there wouldn't be jobs for all these children, and so they reversed course in the 80s. Birth rates today are down to 1.6 to 1.9. This is totally in line with Europe. However, Iran still has this balloon of a population with a lot of people in their 20s, 30s, and 40s, and we'll have to see how that plays out. Finally, when it comes to foreign policy, clearly Iran has had a strained relationship with the West that goes beyond 9/11, but was certainly exacerbated by that event. The attitude of international organizations toward Iran have been mixed. Iran tried to join the World Trade Organization in 1996, but it failed. Still, Iran is a member of OPEC, oil-producing countries. The biggest issue here is nuclear power. The US and other Western states have long opposed Iran obtaining nuclear weapons. Since 2006, the UN has sanctioned Iran for pursuing a nuclear weapons agenda. Iran, of course, denies this. Iran says that its pursuit of nuclear technology is for power generation only. In 2015, Iran signed a nuclear deal with the West, including 1. Limits on Iran's nuclear programs, 2. Continuation of uranium enrichment, 3. The threat of return sanctions, and 4. Comprehensive inspections, among other smaller things. The reason I won't go too much into this is because in 2018, the US pulled out of the deal, so this remains very much an open question going forward, as does the political future of Iran.